be beginning our new unit. We're going to be starting with West and Central Asia, and then we're going to move our way eastward as we progress through the unit. So we've already covered a couple of artworks that have their origins in Western and Central Asia. You might recall from our early Europe and colonial Americas presentations that we covered a couple of mosques and Islamic art objects. So hopefully some of the information that we'll be covering in the next couple of minutes will be reviewed to you. So one of the things that's important to remember about this region is that it is typically regarded as the meeting place of Western and Eastern cultures. It's connecting Europe and Asia. And it actually was one of those like intersection points that was along the Silk Road trading routes as far back as like thousands of years ago. One of the artworks that we're going to be covering in this unit is Petra, which is this massive complex in the Arabian Peninsula in what is now Jordan. And it was this complex that was built, and it was actually inspired by a lot of Greek and Roman architecture that was being made in this region of the Mediterranean over here. So, one thing to also remember is that West and Central Asia is a somewhat roughly defined term. Some people include India in this designation, whereas the AP curriculum tends to define India as kind of being a part of like India and Southeast Asia. That's kind of like the designation that they give. So also the borders that we see today in terms of like the international borders are a lot different from those of the past, and the borders are also pretty constantly changing due to a lot of the activity that is happening here politically. So the art from these regions, you can imagine, reflects a crucible of cultures, a melting pot, if you will, blending mixtures of East and West, as well as traditions that are arising kind of independently within this region. But one of the dominant religions that is going to be influencing art, at least the art that we're seeing within the curriculum, is Islam. So most of the works that we're going to be covering in this unit are Islamic in nature. Buddhism, which we'll talk about a little bit later, emerges from South Asia and mostly spreads east. Islam starts in the Arabian Peninsula and spreads eastward, and then we've also seen some maps that has spread westward, and we saw kind of like the Umayyad Empire kind of going into Spain and so on. I believe it's on this map. Yep, here we go. Yeah, so North Africa, Spain, and so on. So a couple of dominant art forms that you might notice in the next couple of slides are textiles, metalwork, book illumination, and occasionally ceramics. So a lot of the artworks from these regions are called Islamic, but they might not necessarily have been produced by Muslims and or for religious purposes. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. Just a reminder from the last time that we covered artwork that has its origins in this region. So this is a review slide from a couple of units ago. Again, this map is just illustrating the spread of Islam, both east and west. It's again important to remember that the Silk Road trading routes are largely responsible for the transmission of a lot of this information. It's also important to remember that, like, quote unquote, Islamic art is very diverse in nature. It doesn't really have a defined type. Usually the shared factor is the faith of the artist and or the patron. So a lot of the times we will see artwork that has kind of like a base kind of quote unquote Islamic influence, but there's lots of regional styles that are also influencing the kind of work that is being created in these regions. There's also like an important thing to remember is that one of the kind of like important things about Islam is that a lot of factions of Islam prohibit the depiction of humans and animals in religious artwork. So oftentimes when you go into a mosque, you will not see images of people or animals. So this prohibition sometimes extends to secular artwork as well in certain regions and time periods, but this is by no means a hard and fast rule. And we will oftentimes see figures and animals represented in secular objects as well. In terms of a couple of terms that you should understand for this unit moving forward, a lot of them pertain to these, again, quote unquote, Islamic art forms and art styles. As a general rule, a lot of the art objects that we're seeing in this unit were produced for wealthy patrons, both locally and abroad. So there were, of course, the shahs or kings that were kind of like centralizing wealth in a lot of ways and could commission these very elaborate artworks like illuminated manuscripts or these large and elaborate mosques and other kind of like religiously central buildings. Um, in terms of the kinds of designs and motifs that we see on these artworks, patterns are very popular. One of the design motifs that we see most often is the arabesque. So this is a repeating pattern that is usually used in borders. Oftentimes you will see split leaves and zigzags. They're very organic in their shape, and they're oftentimes used in these kind of meandering, like plant-like forms. A really important art form within Islamic art is calligraphy. This is considered the highest form of art, as it was used to transmit the texts revealed from Allah, who is God in Islam, to Muhammad. So this is literally the word of God that is manifesting as a physical object, so it is considered sacred. So we will see calligraphy oftentimes featuring like a more prominent role in a given artwork. We also have tessellations, which are quite common. Tessellations are something that you may have seen before in a math classroom. It's basically a repeating interlocking pattern with no gaps. So imagine taking like a stamp and repeating the pattern. You could basically repeat it into infinity and there wouldn't be any gaps in between the designs. So one of the things that you'll notice, at least in these two images, and when we start looking at mosques as well, is that the elements of patterning that are used in Islamic art are very mathematical in nature. They're organized. There's a sense of order where everything kind of has its place and everything is kind of like following these lines of either bilateral or radial symmetry. This sense of visual harmony is directly referencing Islamic ideology that the universe was built on logic and design, that everything was made in kind of like Allah's ideal vision, where everything has a purpose and everything has a place. Another thing that we're going to be seeing as we cover mosques, not this lecture, but the next one, is that there are usually structures in place that are conducive to praying in the direction of Mecca, which is one of those 5 pillars of Islam. So we will, for example, see structures like minarets where people are ascending towers and calling people to prayer. We will also see niches or mihrab that are going to be indicating the direction of Mecca so that people can pray in the correct direction. So our first work from this unit is the folio from a Qur'an. So the Qur'an, you might recall from the last time we covered Islamic artwork, is essentially the holy text of Islam. It is roughly equivalent to the Bible in Christianity or the Torah in Judaism. So Qur'an literally means recitation. This is the word of Allah as it was transmitted to the Prophet Muhammad. So this particular Quran is one of the earliest known surviving examples of this kind of manuscript. You can notice by the date that it is relatively early. Muhammad is active around 622 CE into the kind of middle part of the 7th century CE. So this is a relatively early iteration of this kind of manuscript. So what you'll notice when you look at this particular page is that there is some text that is very dark and bold and very easy to read right here. And then we have this more heavily ornamented script that is inscribed within this, this rectangle right here. So this part right here, this text that is inscribed within the rectangle is basically the title of the verse, which in Arabic is surah. The beginnings of verses are also indicated by these 6 circles that are kind of arranged in a pyramid shape. You'll recall that Arabic is read from right to left, so you would start on this side and then go here. So this is the start of a new verse. It goes here, and then across this way, across this way, across this way, and then ends here. So the title of the surah is indicated here, and then this is the actual content of the text. So in terms of the specific kind of text that is being used here, this is called Kufic script. There's a lot of these very, there's a very emphasized sense of horizontality. You'll notice that a lot of these characters are very much stretched out. And this is what a lot of people assume to be some sort of kind of like intonation in terms of like how long you're supposed to hold a vowel or a consonant when you're reciting. So it's almost like sheet music in a sense, where it's telling you the beat of how things are supposed to be recited. Another thing that is notable about this text is how bold it is. It is thought that something like this would have probably been used by multiple people at any given time, so it would probably have been mounted on some sort of stand, and then many people would have been able to read it at any given time, which is why the text is made in this very bold way. Another thing that is done with this particular script is that there are these red dots right here. So these red dots are essentially kind of like little clues that indicate how these specific letters are supposed to be pronounced. It's similar to Hebrew, where you sometimes have like little accents on the side that help to indicate the identity of the character, because a lot of times one character can mean multiple different things. Our next piece is referred to as the Basin, or the Baptistére de Saint Louis. I probably didn't pronounce that right. Whatever. So this particular work was signed 6 times by the artist Muhammad ibn al-Zayn. I would love to have that kind of confidence to sign an artwork 6 times. So the provenance of this particular artwork is not super well known. There's not a dedication on the artwork to indicate the original owner or patron. So the provenance of this object is unknown. Oftentimes, especially in the Islamic world, when an artwork is created for a specific patron, it will be dedicated in some way. You might recall in the Pyxis of Al-Mukhira, that perfume container that we covered in the first semester, that the dedication was around the rim of the container, saying like it was for this dude, and like also mentioning kind of like a prayer to Allah. So there's a couple of theories regarding what this particular vessel was used for. It might have been initially used as a banqueting dish, so something to like hold food. A lot of more prevailing theories seem to suggest that this was used as a basin for ritual ablution, so ritual hand washing. You'll recall that in Islam, one of the things that you have to do before you enter the mosque is wash your hands and feet so that you are not kind of like bringing dirt and impurities into the holy site. So a lot of times that hand washing was turned into something that was a little bit more of a symbolic ritual as well. So this kind of basin might have been used for like a more elaborate ceremony that involved hand washing. One of the things that supports this theory is the use of these zoomorphic designs in the bottom of the basin, which include lots of aquatic animals, including eels, fish, and crocodiles, I believe. So there's also, in terms of the provenance of this object, it did end up in France later, and it was actually used by members of the French royal family for baptisms, but not, as the name would suggest, for St. Louis. The object is actually older than St. Louis, and he actually died before this object was probably made. So along the outer side of this particular vessel, we have these court scenes of the Mamluks. So the Mamluks were a northern Indian Muslim empire, and they ruled parts of Egypt and Syria for around 300 years. There were lots of scattered empires and caliphates, and in some cases, especially after the Mongols came in, khanates, where they were kind of like these scattered kind of like pockets of influence across Western and Central Asia. And this particular artwork was produced by the Mamluks. So along the outer rim, there are 4 roundels. So a roundel is, again, an image that is inscribed within a circle. And each of these roundels contains a horseman. And they separate approximately 20 Mamluk emirs, or officials, each depicted in court finery. Here's a couple of examples of those officials. And you can see like the amount of detail is just absolutely exquisite, like going so far as to like being able to communicate the facial expressions and gestures, depicting the detail on this sort of shawl right here. It's just astounding. So on the inside, on the inner rim, there are even more designs. We have hunting scenes, lots of images of animals. I believe on this side there's an image of a leopard right here. There's lots of fish and birds, foxes, lots of animals that are typically pursued in hunting. And then there's also these little coats of arms on either side right here that feature the fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol that is oftentimes associated with royalty, interestingly, in both the Mamluk court as well as the French court, which is probably why, this is one of the reasons that some people speculate that this object may have been actually made for the French royal family intentionally, instead of made for the Mamluk court. So there's, again, lots of theories surrounding why this particular object was made and who it was for. This is perhaps the most emblematic work in the AP curriculum of the concept of horror vacui, which is, again, that high density of design, literally the fear of empty space. There's also this notion that the materials that were used are very costly. We have gold and silver that are being used to coat the surface of this object, and the process that was involved in covering this object and plating it and then creating all of these intricate designs was also extremely labor intensive and time consuming. So it is certain that this object would have been manufactured for somebody who was probably like a member of royalty or a king. It was a luxury item for sure. Here's again some more examples of this beautiful inlay. A lot of students ask where this black comes from, and my best guess is that it was probably bitumen or some sort of other tar that was kind of rubbed into the etched lines right here to increase the contrast and to show the detail a little bit more finely. Our next work is the Ardabil Carpet. So this is actually one of a pair of matching carpets made for a funerary mosque devoted to a Sufi leader known as Safi al-Din Ardabili. So he lived in the town of Ardabil, so this is for which the carpet is named, and where he also kind of like where this name comes from. When you have the name and then I at the end, that usually means like of Ardabil or of whatever the location is, indicating their origin. So the descendant of Safi al-Din Ardabili actually would go on to found the Safavid dynasty, which lasted for around 200 years. And the Safavids would go on to commission lots and lots of artwork, including textiles such as this, as well as illuminated manuscripts and mosques. So unfortunately, the carpets were damaged in an earthquake a couple hundred years ago. So the better preserved carpet was repaired using the pieces of the more damaged carpet. And so there's actually like this carpet right here, which is currently in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England. And then there is the smaller version of the carpet that is currently at LACMA. So this is to scale. Like you can definitely see like where the parts of this carpet were kind of like Frankensteined over into this one right here in order to restore it. You'll notice that in addition to the size being different in this carpet versus this one, that this one is also lacking certain details, including these kind of like little motifs on the side right here, and then also this outer border. So this is essentially a huge version of a prayer carpet. A prayer carpet is something that a typical person who practices Islam would have. You would basically roll it out and point it towards Mecca in order to facilitate your prayer 5 times a day. Obviously, no one person is going to require a 35-foot long carpet. So this was more of like a ceremonial or commemorative carpet rather than something that would have been used by any one person. And these carpets were actually a pair, and both of them were located in this massive funerary mosque. So when you actually go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, it is laid out on the floor. Obviously, there's a barrier around it, but it is just absolutely exquisite, and it's massive. And one of the things that is particularly notable about this carpet is the degree of detail that is evident. And one of the ways that this detail was able to be achieved was the high knot count per square inch. So typically when you purchase a Persian carpet, it has around 120 knots per square inch. So that's the number of times that the manufacturer is tying the wool piling onto the silk back. So this particular artwork involved 340 knots per square inch, which is almost triple the normal amount of knots. So you can imagine that there's going to be more detail. A lot of students kind of struggle with understanding precisely what this means. I would say, like, thinking about it in terms of like having an image that's a low resolution and having like kind of like being really pixelated versus something that is going to be of a higher resolution and there's more pixels per square inch. And that's kind of like what this essentially means. The more pixels that you have, the more detail that you're able to get. So each carpet is approximately 25 million knots, which is just incredible to think about. So this piece was likely produced by a team of up to 10 men who are working at once. Typically, these carpets involved a silk warp and weft, so that is basically the foundations of the carpet, and then dyed wools were then tied onto the silk warp and weft. Wool was usually used because it absorbed dyes and pigments a little bit better than silk did. But silk was usually like stronger than wool, which is why it was used as kind of like the scaffolding or the back of the carpet. So it probably would have been entrusted to men because it was considered a hierarchically very important task, creating something for a prayer mosque, and also probably would have taken around 4 years per carpet, approximately. What you'll notice when you look at this carpet is that there are, of course, these floral design motifs, which again are very popular in Islamic art. One of the most interesting design elements that a lot of people like to speculate about is this this motif in the middle. And most scholars tend to agree that this is supposed to depict the inside of a dome. So you might recall when we covered the Hagia Sophia that when you went to the center of the mosque, that you would look up and you would see this halo of light around the dome. So it's thought that these were the windows that were kind of going around the dome and that this was the dome itself. These two designs right here are thought to be incense lamps that are hanging from the ceiling. And they're kind of at an angle to communicate the vastness of the space. And also, I think that because foreshortening would have not been able to communicate precisely what these objects were. But you can see like the strings that are coming from these little bits right here to suggest that it's coming down. And you're basically like looking up, straight up into the center of the dome. Our next piece is from a Persian manuscript. It is referred to as Baharam Fights the Karg. So Persian manuscripts derive a lot of their aesthetic from Chinese paintings. And this makes sense because, again, what is now Iran is at the crossroads of the East and the West, particularly at this point in time. So around 1200 CE, we started having Mongol invasions coming in from the East and bringing lots of influences and tastes in from what is now China and Mongolia and so on. One of the most important inventions that was brought westward was paper. So paper became a medium that was used for manuscripts. Like previously, like before this, vellum was used primarily for illuminated manuscripts, which is very expensive. So paper was a little bit more accessible. One of the other things that was kind of like popularized by the Ilkhanate, which was this Mongol kind of originating dynasty in Persia, was this taste for small portable luxury items. The Mongols were largely nomadic. They traveled on horseback, and you can imagine they're not really able to carry lots of large worldly possessions with them. So kind of like smaller portable precious objects would have probably been more ideal. One of the things that was kind of like considered like a precious item was a manuscript. Oral tradition was also very important to the Mongols, so you can imagine that having this oral tradition being preserved on paper would have been something that was very ideal. So they very much kind of like fueled the production of manuscripts like this. So this particular manuscript is from a collection of narratives known as the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. So this manuscript was constructed around 1000 CE and was extremely popular for hundreds of years. Actually, when you a lot of students in what is now Iran still learn a lot of these narratives. The Shahnameh is a collection of these stories about kings. A lot of them are kind of more mythological in nature. Like, obviously, there isn't a creature that looks like this in real life. It's essentially like a wolf with a giant unicorn horn. Some people think that it's basically like a game of telephone version of what a rhinoceros is. There's lots of speculation as to exactly what this creature is supposed to be. But a lot of the narratives that were within the Shahnameh are intended to be didactic in nature. They are intended to show this is what a brave and moral and good king does. Like, he risks life and limb to go kill a beast that is ravaging the countryside, or he brings peace and order to both nature and man. So a lot of these narratives are very like allegorical in that way. So the king here is shown in a victory pose. He has his axe thrown over his shoulder and he is on horseback, standing over the slain Karg or horned wolf. The narrative behind this piece is that when he was traveling eastward in what is now India, Baharam came across a king that was ruling a province in India, and he said, there's this nasty beast that is like destroying our land and terrorizing our people. And he was like, I'll go kill it. And so he does, and then everybody like loves him. So that is essentially the narrative or the story behind this piece. So, a couple of things to note about this piece in terms of the aesthetics. One of the things that is especially evident is the hierarchic scale of Baharam Gur right here. He is very large in comparison to this horse. This is something that we also saw in equestrian statuary in ancient Rome, where the king figure is portrayed as larger than life, and like so large in fact that the horse probably wouldn't be able to support his weight. So this is something that is oftentimes done with kings and other authority figures to emphasize their importance. This is hierarchy of scale. It's something that we've seen since prehistoric times. Another thing you'll notice is that he has this halo behind his head, and this is a very Christian convention. We saw it especially in Byzantine artwork, where you have this illumination behind the head, usually to indicate holiness or to separate the head from a complex background. So it's creating emphasis in some way. The crown is also very Western looking. He's also wearing clothes that are fine European fabrics. So probably like fine goods that would have come from Milan, for example. What you'll also notice is that the background is very East Asian looking. The ways that the trees and the plains of land are overlapping with one another is a convention that we very frequently see in Chinese landscape painting. So this is very clearly influenced by those artistic conventions that are coming out of East Asia at this point in time. Our next piece is also from a Shahnameh, but keep in mind that this is a completely different kind of like collection of manuscripts. Like, this collection of manuscripts for Baharam Gur came from the 1300s. This particular set of manuscripts came from the 1500s, so around 200 years later. The Shahnameh is popular enough that there are two separate AP artworks that are both depicting narratives from the Shahnameh. So this particular work is of Safavid origin. You'll recall that the Safavids were the same dynasty that produced the Ardabil Carpet, or the descendants of the dynasty that produced the Artabil Carpet, rather. And this is just one manuscript of many that was produced as a result of royal patronage to the arts. The Safavids, again, in particular, were very generous patrons to the arts, funding lots of large-scale projects. This particular artwork would have likely been commissioned for a person in power, probably Shah Tahmasp, and likely involved several artists. So this is just one folio of a collection of pieces that were probably bound in a single book. Unfortunately, a lot of these manuscripts are now in pieces because they were separated into different pages or folios in order to obtain a higher price per page when these things were sold at auction, which is super unfortunate. So a lot of these manuscripts are now in pieces, and the pieces are scattered around the world. So the construction of a manuscript like this was so involved that it was rather difficult for any one single person to bring the manuscript into being from start to finish. So a lot of times these manuscripts involved several artists. Just like we saw with the illuminated manuscripts in Western Europe, there was probably one person that was responsible for doing the calligraphy, for example, maybe one or two people that were responsible for doing the figures' faces or hands, and then one person that was responsible for the clothing, and then another person that was maybe doing the animals and plants, and then another person who was doing the background. So it was likely a team of people, which we refer to in the AP curriculum as the workshop of the Sultan Muhammad, that were involved in creating manuscripts like this. So this particular narrative depicts another event from the Shahnameh, which is the kind of like the ascent to power of the first king of Persia, who's known as Gayumars. He is depicted here at the upper center of this composition, and he is surrounded by his court in the semicircle right here. His son and his grandson are at his left and right here, respectively. So we have this very orderly composition, relatively bilateral symmetry, more or less, where you have the king at the center. He is hierarchically the largest figure in the composition and also the highest up. And then, of course, his son and his grandson are just below him. So the text right here translates roughly to basically describing what is happening in this scene. So it's describing when Gayumars became king of the world. He built his first residence in the mountains. His posterity and his palace rose from the mountains, and he and his people wore leopard pelts. Cultivation began from him, and the garments and food were ample and fresh. So the idea of this scene is to create this kind of like utopia and paradise, where everything is perfect, everything is kind of like teeming with life. It's very kind of like there's kind of like a bountiful harvest here. Interestingly as well, there's lots of animals that have been depicted, and in some cases, the animals and the humans are interacting quite friendly. So there's this notion that the order and the peace that is established by Gayumars is such that even the wild animals have been tamed. There's actually a scene over here where you have a man that is holding a lion cub, which I would 100% not recommend that you do. So this is a kind of like representation of this almost cosmic level of order that Gayumars is supposedly achieving as the first king of Persia. Another interesting kind of like design element of this piece is like the way that Gayumars is emphasized. He has this negative space around him in this light periwinkle that is kind of separating him out from this very chaotic narrative. And then there's also gold in the sky that has been used to kind of create another kind of halo element around him. So this is creating a sense of emphasis on this character. He is definitely at the center of this composition. He's the first person that you're supposed to see. Another kind of element that is supposed to depict this harmony and balance is the court. So oftentimes, one of the ways that a king will be depicted in an artwork and to show his power and his influence is to show the members of his court, his entourage, essentially, the people who operate under him, quite literally in this sense. And they are all wearing leopard pelts here. That's what these spots are supposed to communicate here. What's interesting is that each of these figures has like different facial expressions, they're in different poses. There's obviously an individuality that is intended in the depiction of these members of the court here, which is really interesting. This view also shows the complexity of the design. You have this layering of flora and fauna on top of one another, and these kind of like swirling, undulating patterns that are again kind of indicating this East Asian influence. Perhaps the most obvious East Asian influence is towards the top portion of the composition, where we have these swirling clouds, and then again these very kind of like East Asian stylized looking trees. So there's Gayumars again. I just love the extremely large-headed lions. So I would definitely recommend that you think about this piece in association with Baharam Fights the Karg, in terms of being a piece that is made in what is now Iran and depicting lots of Eastern influences.